Inspector Blackwell possessed the particular air of a man who had solved exactly 3 murders in his entire career, all of them transparently obvious and requiring minimal deduction. His face, when he descended the stone steps of Hollow Down, bore the expression of someone who had already filed away the Ashford matter as concluded. A regrettable suicide, the paperwork nearly completed, the case effectively closed in his mind before the body had grown cold. "Lord Peter Wimsey," he said, extending a hand with the cautious courtesy of a policeman who had been briefed on the visitor's credentials but remained fundamentally suspicious of private investigators. "I must confess, Mr. Faraday's call to you seemed somewhat premature. We have sufficient evidence to suggest—" "Evidence?" Peter interrupted gently, shaking the hand with the precise amount of firmness that suggested neither aggression nor weakness. "Is merely observation, arranged according to preconceived conclusion. Inspector, I find myself profoundly curious about the window." Blackwell blinked. "The window, my lord." "Indeed. The library window. You see, Mr. Faraday mentioned that the door was locked from the inside, which immediately suggested suicide to your quite reasonable mind. But a locked door, Inspector, is merely a locked door. A locked window, however, particularly one situated at a convenient height above a reasonably situated flower bed. That is rather more theatrical, wouldn't you say?" The inspector's face adopted that peculiar rigidity which indicated he had not, in fact, examined the window with any particular attention whatsoever. Behind Peter, Bunter emerged from the motor car carrying his leather case, moving with the silent efficiency of a man accustomed to being precisely where he was needed at precisely the moment he was needed. "Perhaps we might examine the scene directly," Peter suggested, already moving toward the door. "I find that standing about in fog tends to make one's observations rather blurry, metaphorically speaking." Blackwell led them through a hallway that smelled of furniture polish and the peculiar staleness of a house that had recently harbored unpleasant events. The walls were lined with hunting prints and photographs of colonial landscapes. South Africa, Peter presumed, scenes from Ashford's distant past. A grandfather clock in the entrance hall stood silent, its pendulum arrested, and Peter noted this without comment, though his eyes lingered upon it for rather longer than seemed necessary. The library was precisely as Gerald had described it. Modest, lined with books, dominated by a leather wingback chair positioned behind a mahogany desk. The chair itself bore the indentation of long occupation, and the desk held the paraphernalia of a man's quiet life. Correspondence, a desk calendar, a fountain pen lying askew as though recently abandoned. The revolver, having been removed by the police surgeon, was no longer in evidence. What was in evidence, however, was the window. It was a tall sash window, the sort common to Victorian construction, positioned directly beside the desk. As Peter approached it, his movements took on a peculiar quality, not quite investigative, but rather the movements of a man conducting a conversation with an inanimate object. He examined the frame, the catch, the sill with meticulous attention. Then he turned to Bunter. "The measurements, if you would be so kind." Bunter produced his tape measure with the solemnity of a surgeon selecting instruments. While the inspector watched with mounting bewilderment, measurements were taken. From the window to the chair, from the sill to the ground, from the corner of the room to the door. Each number was carefully recorded in a small notebook that Bunter maintained with the precision of a man keeping records that might someday be required as evidence. "Fascinating," Peter murmured, running his fingers along the interior sill. "There is dust here, but only in this particular pattern. Rather as though something heavy had rested upon the sill recently. Something that had been moved, one might venture to suggest, within the past day or two." "The inspector has already examined," Blackwell began. "Undoubtedly he has," Peter said without a trace of malice, with the eyes of a man looking for evidence of suicide. "But you see, Inspector, that is precisely the difficulty with preconceived notions. They blind one to the evidence that contradicts them. Now then, the flower bed beneath this window, What grows there? Begonias, the inspector replied, somewhat bewildered. Hardy varieties for the season. Peter pulled the window open. It moved with the smooth silence of recent use and leaned slightly outward, examining the earth below. The fog had crept into the room like an unwanted guest, and Bunter immediately moved to stand closer, as though to intercept it. Curious, Peter said, withdrawing. The earth is quite disturbed here. Footprints, I should say, though the rain has rendered them indistinct. Recent footprints, judging by the freshness of the exposed soil. Inspector, I wonder, was this window examined for forced entry? There is no evidence of forcing, Blackwell said stiffly. The catch is intact. The frame is undamaged. Indeed. And yet someone has stood here, repeatedly, and looked into this room. One might even venture that someone has gained ingress through this window, given the positioning of the latch and the entirely predictable tendency of sash windows to stick slightly when one endeavors to close them quietly from the inside. You see, if one were to climb through with a certain amount of care, one might leave the catch in precisely the position it currently occupies, appearing locked, yet not requiring a key. The inspector's complexion had begun to assume the shade of a man who was belatedly appreciating that he had made a rather fundamental error in his investigation. Behind Peter, Gerald had gone quite still, his attention focused upon the window as though it might suddenly deliver an oration. "You're suggesting the killer entered through the window," Blackwell said slowly. "I'm suggesting nothing whatsoever," Peter replied. "I am merely observing that the evidence points in a particular direction, and that direction is decidedly not toward suicide. Now, shall we examine the door? I confess I am particularly interested in the lock." As they moved toward the library door, Peter paused before a small table upon which stood a decanter of whiskey and several glasses. He lifted one to the light, sniffed it delicately, and set it down again. "The dead man drank alone," he observed. "A man of regular habits, I should imagine. Someone who could be relied upon to occupy this room at a precise hour each evening. Such predictability is extremely useful to someone planning a murder, wouldn't you say?" Inspector Blackwell had no suitable response to this. He simply stood, watching as Lord Peter Wimsey examined the door lock with the intensity usually reserved for ancient manuscripts, his mind already calculating trajectories, timing, and the peculiar psychology of someone who would go to such elaborate lengths to make murder appear as something else entirely. "Tell me, Inspector," Peter said softly, "has anyone questioned the servants regarding the unusual disturbances in the flower bed?" The silence that followed was answer enough. The drawing-room at Hollow Down possessed that particular stuffiness of Victorian interiors, the windows dressed in heavy curtains that admitted no light whatsoever, the furniture arranged with mathematical precision, the very air seeming to have been preserved in amber since the previous century. It was here that Peter established what might generously be termed his headquarters, though in truth he appeared to occupy it with the casualness of a man settling into a hotel lobby before catching a train. Mrs. Cobbett, the housekeeper, was summoned first. She was a woman of perhaps 60, with the pinched face of someone who had spent 3 decades taking care not to observe anything beyond her immediate duties. Her hands twisted the corner of her apron as she stood before them, and Peter noted the particular shade of gray beneath her fingernails, a substance that resembled dust or perhaps ash, though it seemed curiously out of place on a woman otherwise maintained with such meticulous tidiness. "Mrs. Cobbett," Peter began, his tone adopting that peculiar gentleness which he reserved for interviews that required delicacy. "You discovered Mr. Ashford yesterday morning, I understand. What time precisely did you enter the library?" 8 o'clock, sir. Same as always. Mr. Ashford preferred his breakfast at 1:15. And the usual state of the library at that hour. Why, sir, he'd be in his chair, reading the Morning Post or attending to correspondence. Yesterday he was—" She trailed off, her mouth compressing into a thin line. "Deceased," Peter supplied helpfully. "A shocking discovery, I'm certain. Now, did you notice anything unusual? Any disturbance, any sense that the room had been disturbed during the night? No, sir. Everything appeared as it always does. Except, of course, for Mr. Ashford himself. Peter rose and moved toward the window, his movements exhibiting that peculiar grace which suggested his lanky frame was entirely under conscious control. The library window, Mrs. Cobbett. Is there any particular reason one might suppose it to be kept locked during the evening hours? The housekeeper's composure flickered, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Mr. Ashford was particular about security, sir. All the windows are locked at dusk. And you personally attend to this task? Yes, sir. Every evening at 5:30. Peter turned back to face her directly. Including the library window on the evening of Mr. Ashford's death. There was a hesitation, minute but telling. Yes, sir. I locked all the windows as usual. And yet, Peter continued, returning to his chair with the air of a man settling a crucial point. This morning, when Inspector Blackwell examined the library window, it was found to be unlocked. The catch was simply resting in the closed position, requiring no key to open it from the inside. How do you account for this discrepancy? Mrs. Cobbett's hands, still working at her apron, had begun to tremble perceptibly. I cannot say, sir. Perhaps I made an error. I'm getting older, and sometimes one forgets, Peter said kindly, particularly when one is distressed. But you were not distressed yesterday evening, were you, Mrs. Cobbett? The distress arrived this morning when you discovered the body. Tell me, between locking the windows at 5:30 and discovering Mr. Ashford at 8 the following morning, did you observe anything unusual? Any sounds from the library? Any indication that Mr. Ashford had not gone to bed as was his habit? The woman's eyes had taken on a hunted quality. There was a noise, sir. Past midnight. A sort of breaking sound, I suppose you might call it. But Mr. Ashford kept irregular hours. He sometimes moved about the house late into the evening. I thought it was him, and I thought it best not to investigate. Gerald, sitting beside the fireplace, made a small sound of comprehension. Peter, however, remained perfectly still, his expression suggesting he was attending to something far beyond the immediate room, perhaps the quality of the light, or the particular way the curtains hung, or some entirely other matter that existed solely within his own singular mind. And this morning, Peter said softly, when you discovered the body, what was the first thing you did? I screamed, sir. I fear I screamed quite loudly. Then I ran to fetch Mr. Faraday, and Mr. Faraday sent for the police. Before you screamed, Peter interrupted, his tone gentle but inexorable. Did you touch anything? Did you examine the revolver, or Mr. Ashford's hands, or perhaps straighten something that appeared disarranged? Mrs. Cobbett's face had gone quite white. I don't recall precisely, sir. I was greatly shocked. Shock, Peter observed to no one in particular, is a most useful excuse for actions one might otherwise hesitate to take. Now, Mrs. Cobbett, I should like you to describe for me the precise position of Mr. Ashford's body as you found it. Every detail, no matter how trivial it might seem. The housekeeper's recitation was halting, delivered in a voice that seemed to come from very far away. She described the chair, the desk, the angle of the body, the position of the hands. And as she spoke, Peter listened with an attention so complete that it seemed to drain the very air from the room. When she had finished, he thanked her with a courtesy that seemed almost to apologize for the interrogation itself. She was dismissed, and they sat in silence for a long moment before Gerald ventured to speak. She's lying, he said quietly. About something, at any rate. Mrs. Cobbett is a woman of limited imagination, Peter replied, which makes her lies particularly transparent to those accustomed to observing them. She did not lock the library window yesterday evening. She's lying about this because she is protecting someone, and that someone has, I suspect, been receiving visits through that very window for considerably longer than merely the night of Mr. Ashford's death. Who? Gerald demanded. Peter smiled thinly. That, my dear fellow, is precisely what we must now discover. But I suspect we shall find the answer if we examine Miss Helena Ashford's movements on the evening in question. Tell me, is the young lady in residence? She is, though she has scarcely left her room since yesterday morning. How very convenient, Peter murmured. Then I suggest we pay her a call. One finds that shock often loosens the tongue rather remarkably. The upper corridor of the Hollow Down possessed that particular quality of atmosphere which suggested secrets were not merely kept there, but actively cultivated. The wallpaper, a faded pattern of roses that had begun to curl at the seams, seemed to lean inward as though eavesdropping. Peter ascended the stairs with Bunter trailing behind. Gerald having remained in the drawing-room at Peter's request, the presence of too many observers, he had suggested, tended to make young women either more reticent or more theatrical, and he preferred to observe Helena Ashford in a state closer to her natural inclination. Miss Helena Ashford's door was on the eastern side of the house, overlooking what Peter presumed to be the very flower bed that had yielded such interesting traces. He knocked with the gentle precision of a man delivering news that was simultaneously urgent and delicate. Yes, the voice from within was uncertain, the voice of a young woman who had spent the past day and a half alternating between grief and something considerably more complex. Miss Ashford, I'm Lord Peter Wimsey. Your great-uncle's friend, Mr. Faraday, has asked me to investigate the circumstances of his death. I wonder if I might have a moment of your time. There was a prolonged silence, followed by the sound of movement. When the door opened, it revealed a young woman of perhaps 25, with dark hair that had not been entirely attended to, and eyes that possessed the particular redness of someone who had wept, or at any rate, someone who wished to appear as though she had been weeping. I don't see how I can be of any assistance, Lord Wimsey, she said, though she did not attempt to close the door. I was asleep when it happened. Asleep, Peter repeated thoughtfully. In your room, one presumes. Of course. Where else would I be at midnight? An excellent question, Peter agreed, stepping past her into the room with the casual confidence of a man entirely accustomed to imposing himself upon private spaces, and one to which I suspect the answer is considerably more complicated than the simple geographical fact might suggest. You see, Miss Ashford, I have recently observed that the library window below was not in fact locked yesterday evening, despite your great-uncle's well-known habits of security. This suggests one of three possibilities. Either the window was never locked, which would contradict the testimony of the housekeeper, or it was locked and subsequently unlocked from the inside, suggesting someone was already in the room, or it was unlocked from the outside, which would indicate that someone had access to a means of operating the catch, a key, or perhaps a tool of some description. Helena had moved to the window of her own room and was now staring out into the fog-laden darkness with an intensity that suggested she was observing something quite beyond Peter's immediate perception. Her hands, he noted, were clasped before her with sufficient tension to whiten the knuckles. I don't understand what this has to do with me, she said quietly. Don't you? Peter moved to stand beside her at the window. And yet, Miss Ashford, this room, your room, is positioned directly above the library, is it not? One might even venture that there is a drainage pipe or some other convenient means by which one could descend from this window to the flower bed below, should one possess the inclination and the necessity to do so. She turned to face him then, and her expression had altered entirely. Where before there had been calculated composure, there was now something approaching desperation, the desperation of a young woman who had believed herself to be conducting a deception with admirable success, only to discover that the other party had understood her perfectly well from the outset. He was going to send me away, she said, the words tumbling forth in a rush. Uncle Nathaniel. He had learned about Richard, Mr. Armitage, and he was absolutely determined to forbid the connection. He was going to send me to Bath, to stay with his sister, to remove me entirely from Richard's sphere. He had written to her about it. I found the letter quite by accident. And this was unacceptable to you, Peter suggested gently. He was being cruel, deliberately, willfully cruel. Richard is a good man. Yes, his finances are uncertain, but he loves me genuinely. Uncle Nathaniel simply could not abide the thought of anyone else possessing my affection. He was a possessive, petty old man, and he was attempting to control me as though I were a child of 8 rather than a woman of 25. Peter returned to his examination of the room, which was decorated in the manner typical of young women of some fortune. Watercolors on the walls, a writing desk, novels in considerable profusion. He paused before the wardrobe, examining her shoes with an intensity that seemed peculiar until one considered the traces of dried mud upon their heels, mud that matched, almost precisely, the composition of the flower bed below. "Tell me about Mr. Armitage," he said, without turning from his inspection. "His movements on the evening of your great-uncle's death. I presume he was here." "He came after Uncle had retired to the library," Helena admitted. "It was arranged. I left my window unlatched, and he came up the pipe exactly as we had planned. We were going to speak with Uncle together in the morning, to present a united front, you understand. Richard was going to persuade him that marriage between us was not the catastrophe he imagined." "A touching sentiment," Peter observed. "And how long did Mr. Armitage remain in this room?" 2 hours, perhaps. We talked for most of it. He left at midnight, climbed back down the same way he had come." Peter turned to face her again, and his expression was one of profound interest. "And you did not hear any disturbance from the library? No sound of altercation, no unexpected noise?" "There was a sort of crack, I think, like breaking glass, or perhaps furniture being moved. But we thought Uncle was simply moving about as he sometimes did in the evening." "How very convenient that you should think precisely what the killer wished you to think," Peter murmured. "Miss Ashford, I must ask you, when you descended to breakfast this morning and learned of your great-uncle's death, what was your immediate reaction? Not your assumed reaction, but the genuine emotion that struck you first?" She began to weep then, though whether from grief or from the recognition that her deception had been utterly transparent was impossible to determine. "Relief," she whispered. "I felt relief, and I have been despising myself for it ever since." Peter nodded slowly, as though this confirmation of something he had already deduced provided him with a peculiar satisfaction. "Miss Ashford, I believe you are guilty of nothing beyond foolishness and the very human capacity for wishing that an obstacle might remove itself. But I fear that your beloved Mr. Armitage may not share your innocence. Tell me, did he speak with your great-uncle? Did he perhaps go to the library after leaving your room?" The color drained from Helena's face. "He said he wouldn't. He promised me." "They always promise," Peter said softly. "Now, I suggest you prepare yourself for a rather unpleasant interview with Inspector Blackwell, and to attempt to be truthful with him, Miss Ashford. It will serve you considerably better in the end." By the time Peter descended the main staircase of Hollow Down, the fog had grown so thick that the windows had become essentially opaque, black mirrors reflecting nothing but the pale glow of the interior lamps. Bunter was waiting in the entrance hall with a peculiar sixth sense that he had cultivated over years of service, holding a fresh cigarette case as though he had anticipated precisely the moment at which his employer would require nicotine and contemplation in equal measure. "The young lady has confirmed certain details regarding her acquaintance with Mr. Armitage," Peter said by way of greeting, accepting a cigarette with the air of a man receiving a benediction. "I now find myself possessed of a rather pressing curiosity regarding the gentleman's current whereabouts." "Gerald." Faraday emerged from the drawing-room, where he had apparently spent the intervening time in conversation with Inspector Blackwell, who trailed behind him with the aspect of a man who had begun to suspect that his case, far from being solved, had merely been demonstrated to be considerably more complicated than he had previously believed. "Armitage has taken lodgings at the Crown and Anchor in the village," Gerald said. "A modest establishment, but respectable. The inspector was about to send someone to fetch him for questioning." "How very thorough," Peter observed, moving toward the study where he had established his observations. Though I confess I should prefer to speak with the gentleman prior to his arrival here, where he will have had the opportunity to arrange his expressions and his excuses into something resembling coherence. Inspector, I wonder if you might accompany us to this Crown and Anchor. I suspect your official capacity may prove useful should Mr. Armitage prove reluctant to engage in conversation. Blackwell, whose confidence had been steadily eroding since Peter's examination of the flower bed, nodded with the alacrity of a subordinate who had begun to recognize that his initial assessment of the case had been not merely incorrect, but embarrassingly so. Within 20 minutes, they were again in Gerald's Sunbeam, navigating the fog-shrouded lanes toward the village proper. Kettleford, in the grip of November darkness and atmospheric obscurity, possessed that peculiar quality of English villages where absolutely nothing occurred, and yet, somehow, everyone was intimately aware of everything that transpired. The Crown and Anchor occupied a corner position near the church, its windows glowing with a sort of golden light that seemed designed to comfort the weary traveler. Within, the public room was occupied by precisely 3 individuals: a barman polishing glasses with mechanical dedication, an elderly gentleman absorbed in what appeared to be a sporting periodical, and a younger man of perhaps 30, with the aesthetic features and expensive dishevelment that typically indicated either artistic pretension or financial embarrassment. Frequently both. Richard Armitage's reaction to the arrival of Lord Peter Wimsey, Inspector Blackwell, and Gerald Faraday was immediate and profoundly revealing. His hand, which had been raising a glass of whiskey, arrested itself mid-motion. His eyes, which had possessed a certain languid quality, suddenly acquired the hypervigilance of a creature recognizing danger. "Gentlemen," Peter said, settling himself into a chair with the casual possession of a man entering his own drawing-room, "I wonder if we might impose upon your hospitality for a brief conversation. Nothing official, you understand. Merely a matter of certain irregularities that have come to my attention regarding the death of Mr. Nathaniel Ashford." Armitage set down his glass with studied care. "I've already spoken with the police. I was in my room all evening. I can hardly be held responsible for..." "For what precisely?" Peter interrupted, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity. "I have not yet accused you of anything, Mr. Armitage. I have merely expressed a desire to converse. Unless, of course, there is something specific for which you fear responsibility." The younger man's composure, which had seemed so carefully maintained, began to exhibit fractures. "I don't see why I should be subjected to this harassment. Whatever has occurred is hardly my affair. And yet," Peter continued, lighting his cigarette with a sort of deliberation that suggested he had all the time in the world, "Miss Helena Ashford has informed me that you were present at Hollow Down on the evening of Mr. Ashford's death, that you gained entry through her window and remained in her company until approximately midnight. midnight. This rather contradicts your assertion that you spent the evening in your room, does it not?" Blackwell leaned forward with renewed interest. Armitage's face had adopted a peculiar shade of gray. "She shouldn't have said anything. I told her not to become involved in this." "A curious instruction," Peter observed, "for a man genuinely innocent of wrongdoing. Innocence, Mr. Armitage, typically welcomes scrutiny rather than fleeing from it. Now, I have a rather specific question for you, and I should appreciate a direct answer. When you left Miss Ashford's room at midnight, did you proceed directly back down the drainage pipe and make your way home? Or did you, perhaps, visit the library?" The silence that followed was sufficiently extended to constitute an answer in itself. Armitage's hands had begun to shake, and the barman, with the practiced discretion of his profession, had discovered an urgent reason to examine something beneath the counter. "I simply wanted to speak with him," Armitage said, his voice acquiring a pleading quality, "to explain my intentions regarding Helena, to demonstrate that I was serious, that I possessed genuine affection for her despite whatever financial difficulties I might be experiencing. I thought if he understood my sincere attachment, he might reconsider his opposition." "And what occurred when you entered the library?" Peter asked quietly. He was sitting in his chair, reading correspondence. When I announced myself, he was enraged, absolutely apoplectic. He said the most terrible things about Helena, about me, about our supposed relationship. He said he would have me arrested for trespassing, that he would ensure Helena never saw me again, that he would arrange for her to be sent away where I could never reach her. Peter nodded slowly, as though this recitation confirmed something he had already suspected. And then, I became angry in return. I said things I shouldn't have said. I told him he was a controlling, possessive old fool. I told him that Helena would marry me regardless of his wishes. He rose from his chair and moved toward the desk. I thought he meant to strike me, or perhaps to summon the servants. I saw the revolver, and I acted without thought. I reached for it. We struggled. And he was shot, Peter said, the statement containing neither accusation nor absolution. It was an accident. The revolver discharged during our struggle. He fell into the chair, and I realized what had happened, and I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I simply left, climbed back out the window, and returned here. I've been attempting to determine whether I should come forward, whether I should admit everything. Peter regarded the young man with an expression that suggested he was observing a specimen of considerable biological interest. You possessed the foresight to stage the room in such a manner as to suggest suicide. You locked the door from the inside, pocketed the key, and exited through the window you had entered by. This suggests a degree of presence of mind rather inconsistent with genuine panic and accident. I didn't lock the door, Armitage protested. It was already locked. When I attempted to leave through the library door, I discovered it was locked from the inside. The only exit was the window through which I had entered. Peter's eyes narrowed fractionally. He exchanged a glance with Blackwell, then turned back to Armitage with the intensity of a man who had just perceived something entirely unexpected. The door was locked from the inside when you attempted to leave? Yes, I had to return the way I came. And you observed no one else? In the library? No second person? There was no one else. Only Ashford and myself. Peter rose slowly, his movements suggesting that he had suddenly perceived that the puzzle he had believed himself to be solving was considerably more complex than he had initially deduced. Inspector, I fear we have made a rather grave error in our assumptions. Mr. Armitage, I suspect you are guilty of many things: trespass, assault, passionate foolishness. But I do not believe you are guilty of murder. The revolver, I suspect, had already been fired prior to your arrival in that library, which means that the person who truly killed Nathaniel Ashford is still at large and has succeeded rather brilliantly in ensuring that the obvious suspect would confess to a crime not entirely of his own commission. The implications of this revelation seemed to settle over the room, like fog creeping through an insufficiently sealed window. The drive back to Hollow Down was conducted in near silence, broken only by the mechanical sound of the Sunbeam's engine and the occasional commentary from Peter, who had adopted that peculiar state of cogitation in which he became almost unreachable to ordinary conversation. Inspector Blackwell sat rigidly in the rear seat, his career prospects undergoing what he must have recognized as a systematic demolition. Armitage remained at the Crown and Anchor under police supervision, though Peter had made it abundantly clear to Blackwell that the young man's detention should be considered provisional rather than conclusive. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall, Peter said suddenly, as though continuing a conversation that had been progressing in his mind for the entire journey, was stopped at precisely 10 minutes past 11. Did you observe this, Gerald? I confess I did not, Gerald replied, navigating a particularly treacherous bend with the concentration of a man encountering it for the first time. I assumed it had simply not been wound. Servants often neglect such details. Precisely what one is meant to assume, Peter agreed, and yet Mrs. Cobbett is a woman of considerable meticulousness. A clock that had ceased functioning would not escape her attention for an entire day. Unless, of course, it had ceased functioning at a moment of deliberate significance. The question becomes, who stopped it and why? To establish a false timeline, Blackwell ventured, his voice suggesting uncertainty. Excellent, Inspector. You're beginning to think rather more precisely than your initial investigation suggested. If the clock was stopped at 10 minutes past 11, it creates an impression that Mr. Ashford was alive until that hour, possibly later. But what if he was, in fact, deceased considerably earlier? What if the clock was stopped to create an alibi for someone whose movements during the crucial hours required obscuring? They arrived at Hollow Down to find it in a state of heightened tension. The servants, sensing that the police investigation had taken an unexpected turn, had begun to adopt that particular attitude of nervous speculation common to households in which murder remained unsolved and potentially imminent. Peter instructed Bunter to assemble the domestic staff in the morning room, a chamber he had observed to be sufficiently spacious to accommodate everyone whilst maintaining the sort of uncomfortable proximity that tends to make liars increasingly anxious. Within 20 minutes, Mrs. Cobbett stood alongside the cook, the second housemaid, the gardener's boy, and 2 other servants whose functions Peter had not yet entirely determined. He examined them each in turn with the air of a man conducting an auction rather than an interrogation. I require absolute clarity regarding the movements of everyone in this household on the evening of Mr. Ashford's death, Peter began. Not the movements you believe occurred, or the movements you have collectively agreed upon, but the actual movements as they transpired. Mrs. Cobbett, you locked the windows at 5:30. Did you at any point subsequent to that hour observe Mr. Ashford? No, sir. He was in the library as usual. And you did not enter the library after that time? No, sir. Mr. Ashford was particular about not being disturbed when he was at his desk. How very convenient, Peter observed. Tell me, Mrs. Cobbett, when did you last observe him actually alive? Not when you supposed him to be alive, but when you genuinely witnessed him breathing, moving, existing as a living entity. The housekeeper's composure wavered. At dinner, sir, 7:30. He took his meal in the dining room as he always does, and afterward retired to the library. And no one saw him subsequent to that hour, until Miss Helena brought the news that he was deceased. No, sir. Peter turned to the cook, a stout woman with the expression of someone accustomed to dealing with far more reasonable problems than murder. You prepared dinner at 7:30. Did you serve it personally, or did someone else attend to that duty? I prepared it, but Mrs. Cobbett carried it to the dining room, sir. Peter's attention swiveled back to the housekeeper with the precision of a searchlight finding a target in darkness. You served dinner to Mr. Ashford. You observed him eating. What was his demeanor? Perfectly normal, sir. He was in good spirits, if anything. He made a jest about the roasted pheasant being rather dry. A man in good spirits, Peter repeated thoughtfully, is not typically a man on the verge of violent confrontation, and yet we are led to believe that within hours he would engage in a desperate struggle with an intruder, resulting in his death. Unless, of course, the violent confrontation did not occur in the manner we have been supposing. He began to pace the length of the morning room, his movements assuming that characteristic rhythm which those who knew him recognized as the precursor to revelation. Consider the facts as they have been established. Mr. Ashford was alive at 7:30. Mr. Armitage entered through the library window at approximately midnight or slightly thereafter. In the interim, Mr. Ashford was shot, and the revolver, his own revolver, was left in his hand or upon the desk. Now, if Mr. Armitage did not shoot him, then someone else must have. Someone with access to the library, someone who knew of his habits, someone who possessed both motive and opportunity. Charles Ashford, Gerald said suddenly. The nephew. He was supposedly in London, but nothing, Peter interrupted. Charles Ashford is indeed in London, and his presence there can be verified by multiple witnesses. The police have already confirmed this. No, the murderer is someone considerably more unexpected. Someone whose presence in or near the library would not have occasioned remark. Someone, in fact, whom everyone has been overlooking because they were so focused upon the obvious suspects. He paused before Mrs. Cobbett, and his expression had become almost pitying. The question I have been neglecting to ask is not who possessed access to the revolver, but rather who possessed access to Mr. Ashford's person prior to any violent struggle. Who could approach him without exciting suspicion? Who would be permitted to stand near him, to adjust his clothing, to ensure that he remained seated in his chair? The implications of this query seemed to settle over the room like a suffocating blanket. "Mrs. Cobbett," Peter said quietly, "the substance beneath your fingernails, the grey dust I observed when you were in the drawing-room, that is not ash from a fireplace, is it? That is gunpowder residue. You fired the revolver, didn't you? Not Mr. Armitage. You." The housekeeper's face crumpled as though subjected to immense pressure. "He was going to dismiss me," she whispered. "After 30 years, he said I was becoming forgetful, unreliable. He had already written to his solicitors to arrange it. I found the letter. 30 years, and he was going to cast me out without reference or consideration." The confession, once begun, seemed to flow from Mrs. Cobbett with the inevitability of water breaching a dam. She sank into one of the morning-room chairs as though her legs could no longer support the weight of 30 years of service and the accumulated resentment of a single moment of perceived betrayal. "I went to the library at 10:30, she continued, her voice assuming that hollow quality of someone speaking from an immense distance. "I wished to speak with him about the letter. I thought perhaps if I explained my situation, my age, my difficulties in securing alternative employment, he might reconsider. But when I entered, he was dismissive. He said I had become a liability, that younger women could perform the duties more efficiently, that sentiment had no place in rational household management." Peter listened with the attentiveness of a confessor, his expression suggesting neither judgment nor absolution. The other servants had begun to shift uncomfortably, and Inspector Blackwell was frantically making notes, as though documenting each word might somehow retroactively improve his investigative performance. "The revolver was on the desk," Mrs. Cobbett said. "He had taken it out that afternoon. Something about the lock being faulty, requiring attention. It was sitting there, fully loaded, and he was sitting in his chair with his back to me, reading a newspaper. He had dismissed me from the room, you see. He simply dismissed me as though I were nothing, as though 3 decades of loyalty signified nothing whatsoever." "And you took the revolver?" Peter prompted gently. "I did not intend to use it. I took it merely to demonstrate something, to show him that I was capable of action, that I was not entirely the insignificant creature he was treating me as." I stepped behind his chair and I said his name. He turned to face me, and when he saw the revolver, he rose from his chair. We struggled, or rather, I struggled, and he attempted to take it from me. He was surprised, you understand, shocked that I possessed the audacity to challenge him. "And the revolver discharged," Peter said. Again, neither question nor statement, but something between. "It was an accident, genuinely an accident. I did not fire it deliberately. My hand was shaking, and he was attempting to wrest it from my grasp, and it simply discharged." He looked at me with such astonishment, such absolute bewilderment, and then he fell back into the chair. There was blood, and I simply stood there, holding the revolver, unable to comprehend what had occurred. Gerald made a small sound of distress. Blackwell had gone quite pale, as though the confession itself constituted a personal indictment of his investigative competence. Peter, however, remained perfectly still, his eyes never leaving the housekeeper's face. "You locked the library door from the inside," Peter said. "You placed the revolver in Mr. Ashford's hand or upon the desk to suggest suicide. You stopped the grandfather clock to create the impression that he had been alive until 11 o'clock or later. These are not the actions of someone in shock, Mrs. Cobbett. These are the actions of someone thinking with considerable clarity." The housekeeper's expression shifted. The grief that had been evident moments before seemed to recede, replaced by something far more complex, a mixture of defiance and resignation. "After the initial shock, yes, I thought quite clearly. I realized that if it were discovered as an accident, I would still be prosecuted. There would still be inquiries and courts and imprisonment. I had nothing to lose by making it appear as suicide. And if Mr. Ashford had chosen to take his own life, well, was that not preferable to the alternative? He was 70 years old. His life was largely behind him, whereas yours, might have continued, Peter finished. Had the deception held? A reasonable calculation from a certain perspective. The question becomes, how did you anticipate the arrival of Mr. Armitage? How could you have known that your carefully constructed suicide would be interrupted by the very circumstance that would unmask it? I didn't know, Mrs. Cobbett said. I heard the noise at the window, the breaking of the catch, and I realized that someone was entering. I'd only just finished arranging things. I was still in the library when he climbed through. I hid behind the heavy curtains near the window and observed everything. When he saw Mr. Ashford, he became distraught, agitated. He touched the revolver, examined the body, and I realized then that Providence was offering me a gift. He would be accused. He would be convicted. My accident would be swallowed up in his guilty actions. You did not think to prevent his false accusation, Peter observed. You did not consider emerging from behind your curtain to explain the truth. Why should I? Mrs. Cobbett's voice had acquired a sharp edge. He was a trespasser. He was engaged in an illicit affair with a girl under Mr. Ashford's protection. He would have been prosecuted regardless. I was simply allowing the law to take its natural course. Peter moved to the window, gazing out into the fog that had begun to thin slightly as the night progressed toward dawn. His reflection in the glass was pale, almost spectral, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that suggested the revelation had cost him something beyond mere intellectual exertion. You have committed murder, Mrs. Cobbett. Attempted murder, perhaps, or manslaughter, depending upon how one wishes to characterize the distinction between accident and intention. But you have also committed something equally grave. You have allowed an innocent man to be accused, convicted, perhaps, of your crime. You have sacrificed Mr. Armitage to preserve yourself, and in doing so, you have revealed the precise nature of your character far more clearly than any accident could have done. He is not innocent, Mrs. Cobbett said bitterly. He entered this house through a window like a thief. He seduced a girl who was under Mr. Ashford's protection. He is guilty of many things, but not of murder, Peter replied, turning back to face her. Which was the singular charge upon which your silence would have condemned him. Inspector Blackwell, I believe you have sufficient evidence to take Mrs. Cobbett into custody. The gunpowder residue upon her hands, her own confession, the circumstances as she has described them, they form a coherent narrative, however tragic its implications. As Blackwell moved forward to perform his duty, Mrs. Cobbett rose with a strange dignity, extending her wrists as though offering them for restraint. In her eyes, there was no remorse, only a kind of grim satisfaction, the satisfaction of someone who had, at least momentarily, transcended her prescribed role and asserted her will upon the world, regardless of the cost. The morning light, when it finally penetrated the fog that shrouded Kentshire, arrived with the reluctance of a guest who had been invited to a funeral. Peter stood in the library of Hollow Down, examining the scene with an intensity that suggested he was reading from it something far beyond what the physical evidence could literally convey. The leather chair bore no stain now. The police surgeon had been thorough in his examination, but Peter seemed to perceive the ghost of that final moment imprinted upon the very fabric. You know, he said to Bunter, who had positioned himself near the door with the quiet attentiveness of a man prepared to assist should his employer require it. The curious element of this entire affair is not the crime itself, but rather the nature of our species' capacity for rationalization. Mrs. Cobbett did not commit murder in a moment of passion. She committed it in a moment of rejected dignity. The wound to her pride, you see, was considerably deeper than any physical wound the revolver might have inflicted. Indeed, my lord, Bunter replied, though I confess I remain perplexed by one element of her account. And that element is? The stopped clock, my lord. Her explanation did not adequately account for the precise mechanism by which she accessed the entrance hall from the library. One would imagine there to be a considerable distance, and the police surgeon established that Mr. Ashford was deceased for some hours prior to his discovery. Surely she would have been observed in the hall if she had attempted to tamper with the timepiece immediately following the incident. Peter turned from the window with an expression suggesting genuine pleasure. Excellent observation, Bunter. You are quite correct. The stopped clock was not positioned by Mrs. Cobbett at all, which means there is a second layer to this deception that has not yet been fully articulated. At that precise moment, Gerald appeared in the library doorway, his expression suggesting he bore information of significance. The police have found something rather curious. Charles Ashford, the nephew, has apparently arrived at the house. He claims he returned from London yesterday afternoon, not this morning as he had originally stated. He says he came to see his uncle regarding a financial matter of some urgency. Peter's eyebrows rose fractionally. How very interesting. And where precisely does he claim to have been during the evening in question? In his room, ostensibly. He says he had a frightful headache and did not leave his quarters until this morning. Of course he says that, Peter murmured, moving toward the door with renewed purpose. Because Charles Ashford, I suspect, knows far more about the stopped clock than Mrs. Cobbett could possibly have revealed. Bring him here, would you, Gerald? To the library. I find that people tend to be considerably more forthcoming when confronted with the location of their transgression. Charles Ashford, when he appeared some 15 minutes later, bore the appearance of a man who had not slept in considerably longer than a single night. He was perhaps 35 years of age, with features that bore a distant resemblance to his deceased uncle, though where the elder Ashford had possessed a certain austere dignity, Charles exhibited only a kind of nervous desperation barely concealed beneath a veneer of professional composure. "Lord Wimsey," he said, extending a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. "I understand you have been assisting Inspector Blackwell with the investigation. I should like to clarify my movements on the evening of my uncle's death. The initial statement I provided was somewhat inaccurate due to certain delicate circumstances. Please," Peter gestured toward a chair positioned near the desk, "do enlighten us regarding these delicate circumstances. I find that they are so frequently the very heart of the matter." Charles seated himself with the deliberation of a man negotiating uncertain terrain. "I did not wish to involve my uncle's reputation in my own difficulties. However, now that it has become apparent that circumstances are considerably more serious than a simple suicide, I feel compelled to come forward with the truth. I arrived at Hollow Down at approximately 4:30 yesterday afternoon. I'd sent a telegram to my uncle informing him of my arrival, though I did not specify the exact time. And your purpose? I had been gambling, Lord Wimsey. Quite extensively, I'm afraid. I had accumulated debts of approximately £2,000, a sum I could not possibly repay without assistance. I came to Hollow Down to request that my uncle advance me the funds. I knew he was unlikely to be pleased, but I hoped that family obligation might prevail. Peter lit a cigarette with practiced ease. "And did you speak with him regarding this matter?" "I did. He was less than sympathetic. In fact, he was absolutely adamant that he would not provide me with a single shilling. He said that I had made my bed and must lie in it, that assistance would merely enable my continued dissolution, and that he had already written to his solicitors regarding the distribution of his estate, specifically excluding me from any inheritance contingent upon my demonstrating financial irresponsibility." "Rather harsh, I should imagine," Peter observed. "And how did you respond to this ultimatum?" Charles's composure flickered. "I was angry, naturally. Very angry indeed. I left the library and retired to my room. I took a brandy, several brandies, if I am to be entirely honest, and I remained there for the duration of the evening. I did not emerge until this morning." "And yet," Peter said softly, "you stopped the grandfather clock in the entrance hall at 10 minutes past 11. You did this to create the impression that your uncle was alive, until that hour, thereby providing yourself with an alibi for the period of his actual death. You were attempting to protect yourself, were you not?" Charles's face went quite white. "I did no such thing. I was in my room." "Then how?" Peter continued, his voice maintaining its gentle precision. "Do you account for the fact that when I examined the clock mechanism this morning, I discovered scratches upon the interior workings consistent with having been deliberately stopped? Someone with mechanical knowledge, someone perhaps with experience in the city and accustomed to the precise functioning of financial instruments, someone such as yourself." "It was not I," Charles protested, but his voice had acquired the hollow quality of a man whose denials had begun to ring false even to his own ears. "I swear to you, I did not tamper with the clock." Peter regarded him with an expression of profound interest. "No, I suspect you did not, and therein lies the curious element of this affair. Mrs. Cobbett has confessed to shooting her employer, yet she made no mention of stopping the clock. Inspector Blackwell assumed it was part of her deception, but upon reflection I believe we must revise that assumption. You see, Charles, someone other than the murderer arranged for that clock to be stopped. Someone who wished to create an alibi, not for the murderer, but for you. Someone who possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to do so." "I don't understand," Charles whispered. "Don't you?" Peter moved closer, his shadow falling across Charles' face. "You do now, I suspect. Helena Ashford was attempting to protect you. She knew of your financial difficulties. You had confided in her, had you not? She knew that you had arrived at the house and confronted your uncle. She feared that you might be suspected of murdering him for his money, and so she, or someone acting on her behalf, arranged for the clock to be stopped. A gesture of familial loyalty, however misguided. The implications of this revelation seemed to settle over Charles like a suffocating mantle. His hands, which had been clenched upon his lap, began to tremble with renewed intensity. The drawing-room had been transformed into what might charitably be described as a theatrical space. Peter, having requested that all parties involved in the investigation assemble there at precisely 3 o'clock on the afternoon following Mrs. Cobbett's arrest. Inspector Blackwell occupied a chair near the fireplace, with the discomfort of a man attending a social function at which he fundamentally did not belong. Gerald stood near the window, observing the proceedings with the air of someone who had invited an orchestra to perform and was now experiencing certain reservations regarding the wisdom of that decision. Richard Armitage, released from custody pending further inquiry, sat rigidly beside Helena, whose face bore the particular pallor of young women discovering that loyalty to family could result in considerably more complicated consequences than they had anticipated. Peter moved between them all with the grace of a conductor preparing an orchestra for a performance that had already commenced without proper rehearsal. He carried no notes, consulted no documents, yet his movements suggested he possessed every detail of the investigation filed with absolute precision within his singular mind. "The curious aspect of murder investigations," he began, positioning himself before the fireplace with the casual authority of a man about to deliver a sermon rather than an accusation, "is that they invariably reveal far more about the living than about the dead. The deceased becomes almost incidental, a catalyst merely for the revelation of truths that the living have been actively concealing. In the case of Mr. Nathaniel Ashford, we have discovered not one conspiracy, but several, each operating independently, yet ultimately intersecting at the moment of his death like railway lines converging upon a terminus." He paused, allowing his gaze to move from face to face. "Mrs. Cobbett murdered her employer. Of this, we have her confession and the physical evidence to support it. The revolver, the gunpowder residue upon her hands, her detailed account of the struggle, these constitute an irrefutable case. She acted from wounded pride, from the recognition that her decades of service were being dismissed as though they had signified nothing. It was not premeditated murder, but neither was it entirely accidental. It occupied that peculiar grey space wherein rage and desperation intersect. Mrs. Cobbett had not been brought to the drawing-room. She remained in police custody, but Peter's words seemed to conjure her presence as vividly as though she had been physically present. Helena began to weep silently, and Richard Armitage's hand moved to her shoulder in a gesture of comfort that seemed to cost him considerable effort. However, Peter continued, his tone acquiring a sharper edge, the case does not conclude with Mrs. Cobbett's confession. You see, the stopped clock presents a problem. Mrs. Cobbett made no mention of tampering with it. She had no reason to do so. Her arrangement of the scene as suicide did not require a specific timeline. She was content to leave matters to police assumption and conjecture. Yet someone, acting after Mrs. Cobbett had departed the library, deliberately stopped that clock at 10 minutes past 11. Someone with access to the house, with knowledge of mechanical matters, and with a compelling reason to alter the timeline of events. Charles Ashford's breathing had become shallow and rapid. He sat with his eyes fixed upon his hands, as though they might provide him with guidance regarding what he should say or do. Charles arrived at Hollow Down at 4:30, Peter said, directing his remarks toward the assembled company rather than toward Charles specifically. He quarrelled with his uncle regarding financial assistance, a quarrel that was heated but ultimately resolved by Mr. Ashford's refusal and Charles's departure to his room. This occurred at approximately 6 o'clock. Charles did not leave his room again, or so he claims, until this morning. However, at 10 minutes past 11, someone stopped the grandfather clock in the entrance hall. Someone who possessed the mechanical knowledge to do so without damaging the mechanism. Someone who, by creating a false timeline, would provide Charles with an alibi should he become suspected of his uncle's murder. Peter turned sharply toward Helena. It was you, was it not, Miss Ashford, not acting from malice but from familial concern? You knew Charles had come to request money. You knew of his financial difficulties. When you learned that your great-uncle was dead, your first thought was not of grief, but of fear. Fear that Charles would be suspected, accused, convicted of a crime he did not commit. And so you arranged for the clock to be stopped. A gesture of loyalty, however misguided. Helena's sobs became more pronounced. Richard pulled her closer, and his voice, when he spoke, was barely audible. She told me what she intended to do. I attempted to dissuade her, but she was adamant. She said that Charles was family, that she could not allow him to be sacrificed for something he had not done. I should have prevented her. I should have informed the police immediately. You should have, Peter agreed without rancor. However, you did not. And in your failure to act, you became complicit in a deception that, while not criminal in the strictest sense, was nonetheless a perversion of justice. The clock was stopped to provide Charles with an alibi. Charles accepted that alibi without questioning its origin, a curious conspiracy of familial love and masculine convenience. He turned back to Charles. You suspected, did you not, that the clock had been deliberately stopped? You knew that someone was providing you with protection, even as you remained uncertain regarding the actual events of the evening. And rather than inquire too closely into the mechanism of your salvation, you accepted it gratefully, asking no questions. Charles looked up, and his expression was one of profound anguish. I did suspect. Helena seemed anxious, nervous, and when I discovered that the clock had been stopped, I did not wish to know the details. I simply accepted that I was being protected. Precisely, Peter said. And there we have it, the complete constellation of human weakness and virtue that surrounds every murder. Mrs. Cobbett, acting from wounded pride, kills her employer. Richard Armitage, acting from passion and desperation, enters the house to defend his beloved. Helena Ashford, acting from family loyalty, attempts to shield her cousin from suspicion. And Charles Ashford, acting from self-interest and cowardice, accepts protection without inquiring into its source. Each of you has committed actions that are simultaneously comprehensible and condemnable. He moved toward the window, gazing out at the fog that had begun to lift slightly, revealing the grey landscape of the countryside beyond. The victim, Mr. Nathaniel Ashford, was a man who attempted to control everyone around him through the exercise of financial power. He sought to control Helena through inheritance, to control Mrs. Cobbett through employment, to control Charles through the promise or denial of familial support. He was, in essence, a man who believed that money could purchase not merely goods, but human compliance, and in the end, it was precisely this need for control that precipitated his death. The silence that followed Peter's pronouncement was sufficiently extended to suggest that those assembled in the drawing room were engaged in the uncomfortable process of recognizing themselves in his observations. Inspector Blackwell shifted in his chair, his official composure beginning to fracture under the weight of implications that extended considerably beyond his initial investigation. Gerald stood motionless at the window, his profile suggesting a man contemplating the precise nature of moral culpability in circumstances where intentions and actions had become thoroughly entangled. It was Charles who broke the silence, his voice emerging as something barely recognizable as speech. "What will happen to Helena? To Richard? They were attempting to protect me, to ensure that I was not wrongly convicted. Surely that must count for something in the eyes of the law?" "The law," Peter replied, returning from the window with movements that suggested he was traversing not merely physical space but temporal distance, "is a peculiar instrument. It is designed to punish actions, not intentions. Helena tampered with evidence, albeit evidence of a mechanical nature rather than physical, and in doing so, she obstructed justice. Richard Armitage remained silent regarding information that might have expedited the investigation. Both are technically guilty of obstruction, though I suspect Inspector Blackwell may exercise considerable discretion in determining whether formal charges are warranted." Blackwell nodded slowly, the gesture suggesting internal conflict. "Given that the actual murderer has been apprehended and has confessed, and given further that the obstruction did not ultimately prevent the investigation from reaching its proper conclusion, I'm inclined toward leniency. Provided, of course, that Miss Ashford and Mr. Armitage are prepared to make full statements regarding their actions." "We are," Helena said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears that continued to track down her cheeks. "I did not think about the consequences. I only thought that I could not bear it if Charles were wrongly accused. Our parents died when I was very young, you see, and Uncle Nathaniel became my guardian. Charles became almost a brother to me. I could not allow him to suffer for something he did not do." Peter regarded her with an expression that suggested he was observing something both tragic and inevitable. "Your loyalty does you credit, Miss Ashford. However, loyalty untempered by judgment frequently results in consequences considerably more severe than those it was intended to prevent. Had you informed the police of your actions, the investigation would have concluded no less successfully, but with considerably fewer complications. As it stands, your deception has created a secondary layer of suspicion that requires now to be disentangled." "What of Mr. Armitage's situation?" Richard asked, his arm still about Helena's shoulders. "He entered the house unlawfully. Surely that constitutes trespass at minimum." "Trespass, yes," Peter acknowledged. "However, given that Mr. Armitage's actions, while foolish, did not contribute to Mr. Ashford's death, and given further that his presence in the house ultimately provided crucial evidence regarding Mrs. Cobbett's deception, I'm inclined to believe that the Crown will show restraint. Inspector, provided he agrees to testify regarding the events as he witnessed them," Blackwell said, "and provided there are no further complications, I see no reason to pursue charges. The lad made a fool of himself, but foolishness is not a crime." Gerald moved from the window, his expression suggesting that a burden of considerable weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Then the matter is concluded? Mrs. Cobbett will be tried for murder, and the rest will be permitted to resume their lives." "The matter," Peter corrected gently, "is concluded only in the sense that the identity of the murderer has been established and her guilt substantiated. Whether justice has been served remains a considerably more complex question. You see, Mrs. Cobbett is guilty of murder. This cannot be disputed. However, she is also guilty of something considerably less prosecutable. She is guilty of having been rendered invisible by the society in which she lived. She served faithfully for 30 years, and in exchange, she received dismissal without consideration, without reference, without the most basic recognition of her humanity. Surely you're not suggesting she should not be held accountable? Blackwell asked, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. I'm suggesting, Peter replied, that accountability exists on multiple levels. Yes, Mrs. Cobbett should be tried and, if the evidence warrants it, convicted. However, the trial should also serve as an indictment of the social structures that render women of her age and station essentially disposable. Mr. Ashford treated her as an object to be retained or discarded according to his convenience. He paid her wages but did not accord her dignity. When his interests changed, he discarded her without a second thought. She responded with violence, and now she will be imprisoned. But the society that created the circumstances, permitting such casual cruelty, will remain unchanged, and other Mrs. Cobbetts will continue to accumulate their grievances in drawing rooms and kitchens throughout the countryside. The weight of this observation seemed to settle over the assembly like a pall. Even Inspector Blackwell appeared to recognize, however dimly, that Peter had articulated something beyond the scope of criminal investigation, something that touched upon the very foundations of social organization and moral responsibility. What you are describing, Gerald said slowly, is a system in which everyone is guilty and no one is responsible. Precisely, Peter agreed, which is why murder investigations, properly conducted, ought never to conclude with the mere identification of the perpetrator. They ought to conclude with a comprehensive examination of the circumstances that made the crime not merely possible, but inevitable. Mrs. Cobbett did not kill because she was inherently evil. She killed because she was desperate and because the society in which she existed had provided her no alternative means of asserting her value as a human being. Bunter appeared in the doorway with the quiet efficiency that characterized all his interventions. A telegram has arrived for you, my lord. From London. It appears to be from the Crown Prosecution Service regarding the preliminary hearing. Peter accepted the envelope and examined its contents without opening it. The machinery of justice is grinding inexorably forward. Mrs. Cobbett will be tried, convicted almost certainly, and imprisoned. The newspapers will publish editorials expressing shock and dismay. The public will condemn her actions as inexplicable and evil, and nothing whatsoever will change regarding the treatment of elderly servants or the recognition of their basic humanity. Such is the particular tragedy of criminal justice. It punishes individuals without altering the systems that produce the crimes. He set the telegram aside with a gesture of dismissal. However, we are not philosophers engaged in abstract discourse regarding social reform. We are investigators tasked with the practical matter of determining who committed a murder and ensuring that justice, however imperfect, is served. In that regard, our task is complete. Mrs. Cobbett murdered Nathaniel Ashford. She will face trial. The rest of you will, I trust, attempt to construct lives of somewhat greater integrity than you have heretofore managed. The autumn rain had begun again by the time Peter and Bunter prepared to depart Hollow Down, transforming the grey landscape into something even more thoroughly melancholic. The fog had lifted entirely, revealing the skeletal trees and stone walls of the Kentshire countryside in all their austere beauty. Peter stood in the entrance hall, examining the grandfather clock one final time, as though it might deliver some ultimate truth regarding the nature of human deception and self-preservation. "The clock will require winding, I imagine," he said to Gerald, who had appeared to bid them farewell. "A curious object, really. We stopped it to preserve a timeline, and in doing so, we altered the entire trajectory of an investigation. Time, Gerald, is perhaps the most deceptive element in any murder inquiry. We believe ourselves to understand its passage, yet we are frequently deceived by it. Mrs. Cobbett believed she had ample time in which to arrange her deception. Helena believed that stopping a clock could arrest the forward movement of consequence. Mr. Armitage believed that entering through a window at midnight might occur outside the bounds of causality, and all of them were wrong. "Will Mrs. Cobbett hang?" Gerald asked quietly, the question emerging as though reluctantly forced from him by conscience. "Almost certainly," Peter replied. "The evidence is conclusive. The gunpowder residue, her confession, the circumstances as they have been established, they form an irrefutable narrative of guilt. However, I suspect the trial will prove considerably less straightforward than Inspector Blackwell anticipates. Her defense counsel will undoubtedly attempt to characterize her actions as crimes of passion, as responses to intolerable provocation. They may, with some justification, argue that a woman of her age and circumstances, facing sudden unemployment and destitution, was driven to desperation by circumstances entirely beyond her control." "Will that defense succeed?" Gerald pressed. "No," Peter said flatly. "The law, whatever its theoretical commitment to mercy, is generally disinclined to show leniency toward servants who murder their employers. The social implications would be too destabilizing. If servants were permitted to kill their employers with relative impunity merely by arguing that they had been treated unfairly, society's entire hierarchical structure would become untenable. Mrs. Cobbett will be convicted, sentenced, and executed. Justice will be served, and the social order will remain undisturbed." There was something in his tone that suggested displeasure, not with the legal system precisely, but with the necessity of functioning within its constraints. Peter had always possessed a certain contempt for the machinery of law enforcement, viewing it as a blunt instrument inadequately suited to the complexities of human motivation and moral culpability. "What of Helena and Richard?" Gerald inquired. "Will they be able to proceed with their plans for marriage?" "Perhaps," Peter said, "though I suspect the scandal will prove considerably more persistent than they anticipate. Society is remarkably long in its memory regarding the families of those involved in criminal proceedings. However, if they possess sufficient fortitude and if Richard Armitage proves capable of establishing himself professionally, which, given his artistic talents and his apparent willingness to reform his financial habits, seems possible, they may eventually achieve something approaching normalcy. Youth, fortunately, is possessed of remarkable resilience." They had moved toward the door, where the sunbeam waited in the drive, its engine running with the patience of a machine anticipating departure. Bunter had already positioned their luggage within the vehicle and had, with characteristic foresight, arranged for their return journey to be conducted with minimal delay. "One final matter," Peter said, pausing on the threshold. "You asked me earlier whether I believe this to be murder. I replied that it always is murder. What I should have clarified is that murder, in its truest sense, is not merely the killing of one individual by another. Murder is the reduction of a human being to an object, the assertion that their existence has become inconvenient and therefore must be terminated. Mr. Ashford murdered Mrs. Cobbett long before she fired the revolver. He murdered her dignity, her security, her sense of value. She merely returned the favor with more finality." Gerald stood in the doorway, watching as Peter settled himself into the motor car with the characteristic grace of a man who had conducted the investigation entirely according to his own peculiar logic and had emerged satisfied, if not precisely content, with the results. "Will you be returning to London immediately?" "To London, and then to my flat in Piccadilly, where I shall attempt to reconstruct some semblance of normal existence," Peter replied, "though I suspect I shall find the attempt unsatisfying. There is something about murder investigations that renders ordinary life almost insufferably dull by comparison. One becomes addicted to the revelation of hidden truths, to the exercise of deductive reasoning upon the most intimate secrets of human behavior. It is a dreadful habit, but one that I fear I shall never successfully abandon." The motor car began to move, its tires crunching upon the gravel with a sound that suggested finality. Peter gazed back at Hollow Down as it receded into the November afternoon, his expression suggesting he was committing the house and its secrets to memory with the precision of a man who understood that places, like people, concealed multitudes of truth beneath their surfaces. "Bunter," he said as they turned onto the main road toward Kettleford, "I find myself possessed of a considerable thirst. Do you suppose the Crown and Anchor in the village maintains any stock of decent claret?" "I believe they do, my lord. Shall I direct our driver to make a brief stop?" "Indeed. We have time before the London train departs, and I find myself in need of libation and reflection in equal measure. Moreover, I should rather like to observe Mr. Armitage in his natural environment. There is something about the young man that suggests his difficulties extend rather beyond mere financial embarrassment. I suspect he is engaged in a private struggle regarding his artistic ambitions versus his social obligations. A struggle that will determine whether he becomes, in the end, either a man of considerable talent or merely another gentleman attempting to appear respectable whilst concealing his genuine nature." They arrived at the Crown and Anchor to find it occupied by the usual complement of rural drinkers, farmers discussing livestock prices, a solicitor's clerk engaged in what appeared to be a flirtation with the barmaid, and Richard Armitage himself, seated at a corner table with the air of a man contemplating the fundamental structure of his existence. Peter directed Bunter to order the claret, then settled himself at an adjacent table with the casual familiarity of an old acquaintance returning to a favorite establishment. "Mr. Armitage," he said, without preamble, "I trust you are occupying yourself constructively during this interval of enforced idleness." Richard looked up, startled, then offered a weak smile of recognition. "Lord Wimsey, I confess I did not anticipate encountering you again so soon. Are you not returning to London?" "Presently," Peter replied, though not before conducting one final observation regarding the psychology of self-deception. "You see, Mr. Armitage, you have spent the past 2 days in a state of considerable anxiety regarding your culpability in Mr. Ashford's death, a culpability that I have now comprehensively demonstrated to be entirely imaginary. Yet I suspect that your relief at this revelation has been tempered by a considerably more profound anxiety regarding your future with Miss Ashford. Am I correct?" Richard's composure flickered. Yes. The scandal will damage her reputation considerably. Her prospects for a respectable marriage have been compromised by association with me and with the investigation itself." "Precisely," Peter said, accepting a glass of claret from Bunter with a gesture of appreciation. "Yet you remain uncertain whether you possess sufficient affection for her to overcome this impediment. You are engaged in the private calculation of whether her value, as a woman, as a potential wife, as a companion for your life, exceeds the social disadvantages attendant upon her connection to criminal proceedings. It is a calculation that does you no particular credit, I should note, but it is also perfectly human and perfectly comprehensible." "What would you have me do?" Richard asked, his voice carrying a note of desperation. "That," Peter replied, "is precisely the question you must answer for yourself. If you love her genuinely, not as an abstraction or as a means of rebellion against her great-uncle's authority, but as an actual human being possessed of independent existence and value, then you will marry her regardless of the social consequences. If, conversely, you value your own comfort and respectability above her happiness, then you will manufacture some excuse and withdraw from the connection. Either choice is defensible, provided you are honest regarding your motivations." He sipped his claret with evident satisfaction. "The difficulty, Mr. Armitage, is that most of us lack the courage to be honest with ourselves regarding such matters. We construct elaborate justifications for our actions. We persuade ourselves that we are acting according to principle when we are, in fact, acting according to convenience. You have been given an opportunity, by circumstance and by the revelation of your relative innocence, to determine what sort of man you wish to become. I suggest you not waste it." Peter rose, setting aside his glass with the finality of a man concluding both his libation and his commentary. "Bunter, I believe we should make our way to the station. The London train will not wait for philosophers engaging in premature wisdom." As they departed the Crown and Anchor, Peter paused momentarily to observe Richard Armitage through the window. The young man sat with his head in his hands, his entire posture suggesting a man wrestling with the fundamental question of his own nature and capacity for genuine commitment. Peter found this observation satisfying, though not necessarily hopeful. Experience had taught him that most people, when confronted with genuine moral choice, selected the path of least resistance. However, there remained always the possibility of exceptions, of individuals sufficiently possessed of courage and integrity to transcend their ordinary limitations. The journey back to London was conducted in the companionable silence that Peter and Bunter had cultivated over years of collaboration. The landscape gradually transformed from the grey austerity of Kentshire to the increasingly urban sprawl surrounding the capital. Peter spent much of the journey reading, a volume of medieval philosophy that appeared to have been selected with deliberate obscurity in mind, and speaking not at all until they had arrived back at his Piccadilly flat. It was there, as the evening fog settled over London and the gas lamps flickered to life along the thoroughfare, that Peter received the final telegram regarding the case. It informed him that the preliminary hearing had been scheduled for the following week, and that Mrs. Cobbett had refused to speak to anyone regarding her motivations beyond the confession she had already provided. "She has achieved a certain dignity in her silence," Peter observed to Bunter, who had brought the telegram along with a fresh martini. "It is almost as though she has decided that the crime itself was insufficient commentary upon her condition, and that further speech would merely diminish its significance. In a curious way, her refusal to elaborate upon her motivations is considerably more eloquent than any extended testimony could be." "Indeed, my lord," Bunter replied. "Shall I arrange for you to attend the hearing?" "I shall attend," Peter confirmed. "Not out of any expectation that my presence will alter the proceedings, but rather from a sense of obligation to witness the conclusion of the narrative I have been instrumental in unraveling. It is a peculiar habit of mine, this compulsion to observe justice being administered, even when I am certain it will prove inadequate to the complexity of the circumstances." He raised his martini in a gesture that might have been either toast or benediction. "To Mrs. Cobbett," he said softly, "to the invisible millions who serve and are discarded, to the precise mechanisms by which society constructs the very crimes it subsequently punishes, and, finally, to the recognition that in solving murders we frequently discover far more about ourselves than about the perpetrator." Outside, London continued its endless nocturnal business, indifferent to the small revelation that had occurred in a country house in Kentshire. The fog rolled through the streets, obscuring pedestrians and vehicles with democratic impartiality. And in his flat, surrounded by books and ancient wisdom, Lord Peter Wimsey contemplated the precise nature of justice and the stubborn persistence of human suffering in a world that seemed increasingly incapable of addressing either adequately. The case of Nathaniel Ashford was closed, filed away in the archives of criminal justice. Yet its echoes would persist, like the stopped clock in Hollowdown's entrance hall, a marker indicating the precise moment at which one life ended and several others were forever altered by the exposure of secrets that should perhaps have remained concealed. This was the true legacy of murder investigations, not the satisfaction of solved puzzles, but the uncomfortable awareness that beneath the surface of every respectable household lay the potential for violence, desperation, and the fundamental human capacity for both cruelty and redemption.